welcome to the Drawing Board. This is our first video game podcast since we rebranded earlier this year. In fact, if you're listening to this, it's probably no earlier than May or something like that, maybe late April, May, or whatever. And what I've done is I've recorded several podcasts about a variety of topics, and this is the first video game one. And this also indicates that I've been very busy this semester and have not been able to complete the rebranding. But if you're hearing this, I finally did. So, hooray, that finally got done. And it's also the first podcast with Patrick. Now, depending on when you, the listener, actually engage this, right? Like you may... this may be like, oh, I listened to a Patrick podcast before from January or whenever it was, and now I'm listening to one again, right? But if you listen to the ones I did with Kip that I pre-recorded in the last couple of months, then you're like, it's been a long time since I've heard Patrick. So, Patrick, how you been doing?
I've been doing great. Well rested, you could even say. Had some delicious bison chili earlier tonight. I am ready to go.
That sounds good, real good. Patrick has a reputation for eating fine food, I have to say. He has a delicate palate, well-developed palate. He is a bon vivant, I think, is the term we're looking for here. And so today's video game that we're going to be talking about is, drumroll, The Legend of Heroes Trails of Cold Steel. And so like we do when we talk about video games here, let's kind of both go into our sort of origin story with the game, I like to say. I'll start because mine's super lame. It's not that interesting. It was basically, hey, I would like more cool JRPGs to play, and I'm asking you this, right? And you're like, hey, Trails of Cold Steel is pretty good. And you're always looking out for me because you're looking at like, hey, this is going to be expensive soon if you don't get this now, or this could become expensive. You should just buy this because it'll go up in price. And I think, and also you thought I would like it, of course, in which you were right. So that was really my exposure to it. I will say I did hear our friends over at the Region Free Gamers podcast talk about this game quite positively before, but it was, of course, your advice that got me to try it out, and I'm glad because it is a little bit more expensive. And by try it out, I mean the PS4 version. There's a PS3 version out there as well. So I played the PS4 version. Patrick, I suspect, as a legendary Nihon Falcom fan, you may have a deeper story than I do in terms of how you got into this.
A little bit different story. But first, just for the record, how much did you pay for Trails of Cold Steel 1?
Oh, I'm going to have to ask the research department real quick, which fortunately I can do that. And what you're hearing right now, when you're hearing this typing, is you're hearing the research department that I pay a lot of money to check this out here, because they have access to my Amazon account, and I can go and look it up in real time, as long as my research department remembers what the password is to my account.
Excellent. Yeah, and I mean, who would administer their own Amazon account? That's
I know that's really just for plebs, right? I mean, obviously we all simply have other people that do our Amazon shopping for us. If you touch your own Amazon account, then clearly you have not progressed far enough in life. So let me try to find where this is. I'm going to have to do a search here. Or the research department, I should say, have to do a search. Because I'm curious about this. Here it is. Okay, yep. So according to the research department, Patrick, I paid, let's see, the current price is $47. I paid $55.
Well, fair enough. And that was approximately a year ago.
But, it was October 30th, of last year.
All right, October 30th of last year. So not even 6 months ago. This is important because if you wanted to buy a new copy of the game, whether it's on Amazon or eBay or whatever, you're looking at $150.
Oh,
So
oh
that
my gosh.
$55 you spent, way better than 150.
And actually, the research department is hurriedly shoving paper under my desk saying, "No, you're wrong. You misinterpreted it." Actually, I didn't. I paid a mere $38.99. I
Oh,
was looking at the total. I had bought some other things.
oh, right,
I
right.
bought Star Ocean Integrity and Faithlessness, which was really cheap, and I have to say I understand why after playing it. But it was not
Yeah,
my favorite JRPG.
yeah.
But yeah, it was $38.99, and you say it's like over $100
It's
now.
over 150 now. That is what can happen in a few months. So,
Wow.
so there you go.
Now, is it because the version I have, it should be known just for our listeners' curiosity, I have the European version, which of course has got the English voice acting and everything. Is that is it like does that matter, or is in terms of what's out there that's really expensive?
Well, I mean, I think there are a couple things at play here. Is I think the U.S. market for uh, games and actually, in particular, Falcom games in general is bigger than the European market. Number two, I'm not quite sure about Europe, but in the U.S. at least, the publisher changed between Trails of Cold Steel 2 and 3. Parts 1 and 2 published by Exceed, parts 3 and 4 published by NIS of America. So essentially, the prospects of parts 1 and 2 being published again in physical form in North America are pretty much zero. So uh, as more parts get released and more people get exposed to the series, they want to go back and get the older games, which are no longer being published. Hence, boom, there goes the price.
And I'm seeing it now. I'm actually looking on eBay. What it is that the European version is still fairly reasonable. I'm seeing that pop up
Yep.
at like this is a used copy and it's an auction, but
Yep.
like $35 or whatever.
Right. Right.
But the American version is definitely going bonkers,
Yep.
as you say.
Yep.
Um, and
So,
so yeah, jump on this
yeah.
one. Jump on that
Yeah.
European version,
Yep.
folks.
Right. Exactly. We have to do our part to make the European version go up in price now. So, yep. Uh, European version, PS4 is region free. There's no DLC that you have to worry about buying. It's fully in English. You may as well get the European version instead of the US version and play that. So
Right.
let's see the European version skyrocket in price now, too.
So your exposure to the series, though, Patrick, what
Yes.
led you into
Yes.
this?
Yep. Yeah. So as you mentioned, I mean, I've been a Falcom fan for a long time, and I'm trying to recall exactly what year it was, but it's the early 2000s, right? Falcom had just released Ease 6, which was a huge, huge deal at the time for people who were interested in Falcom. And I'm trying to recall if it was an ad that was in E6 and a demo disc, or if it was somehow I got the demo and ad with something else. But regardless, uh, Falcom was releasing Legend of Hero 6 Trails in the Sky. And so it looked very nice. It looked like a reinvention of the Legend of Heroes series in the same way that E6 was a reinvention of the Ease series. And so, absolutely, I jumped right on that. And very interestingly, Trails in the Sky ended on a cliffhanger. It actually ended up being a three-part series. So now it's been retroactively labeled first chapter, second chapter, third chapter. Okay. Trails in the Sky was followed up with more Trails games, and the most recent set of Trails games are the Trails of Cold Steel. I actually first was exposed to Trails of Cold Steel. I was in Japan in the year 2013, which is when it was released, but I was in Japan shortly before it came out, and so I saw the ads running on monitors in the game stores. It looked phenomenal. I mean, just the audio visual, especially at the time, it looked fantastic. We can look at it now on the PS4 and say, well, you know what, it looks a little dated, but I was pretty much blown away by what I was seeing and hearing back then. And yeah, so that was how I learned of Trails of Cold Steel. I didn't actually end up playing it though until much later on the PS4, just because I have a ridiculous backlog of games. So
Right.
that was how I came to know of it.
And you make a good point because to those of you that run out and get this, on the PS4, there is going to be a little bit of a visual shock, if you would, because this is a PS3 game originally, and so it does take like a little bit of acclimation. I will say though, the art style and visuals are very clean and easy to understand, easy to kind of parse. They're very colorful. So the character designs, I think, particularly when you compare them with other sort of similar JRPGs, I think the character designs are very good. They're not, some JRPGs, the character designs get kind of silly and ridiculous in all kinds of different ways. I mean, here they're very, I think, appropriate, and also I really like the way they make the various factions visually distinct. I think is another thing that's an art direction thing that has nothing to do with it being like a PS3 game that may have been in 2013, like a really good looking PS3 JRPG, right?
Mm-hmm.
For instance, you have a military faction that's the local kind of military branches run by the nobles that have the provincial armies, they call them. They have the sort of Kaiser Wilhelm World War I style, sort of uniforms, right? Prussian style uniforms, which actually is very influential in Japan, the whole Prussian thing in the late 19th century. So it's kind of cool to see that. And then you have the railroad police uniforms, which are a little, I'll just say they did evoke feelings of a certain mid 20th century army that existed that is often fought against in various American first person shooters. But that's what those uniforms kind of look like. But then you have the students, the main characters, they're kind of military academy uniforms, all very visually distinct. So when you see them in the world, you know exactly who they are.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. It gives it. The uniforms give a nice feeling of which group each character is with, and it also gives the game kind of a grounded. I don't know if realistic is quite the word I'm looking for, but there's some sense of internal realism. There's a hierarchy here. This does not come from the Tetsuya Nomura school of character design. You don't have everyone with their individualistic wild outfits.
Right.
So when you do see a character who is wearing something markedly different from everyone else, it's a little bit more striking because you're like, okay, this person is different and weird. What's up with that?
And you said something that I think I noticed in playing this game, in playing Trails of Cold Steel, which is the verisimilitude of the world. Actually is very good, especially for a JRPG. I say that there's going to be a lot of times where I think where I talk about this game and I say, well, compared to JRPGs, blah blah blah. And what I mean is, it does kind of, I think, improve upon or mildly break away from some conventions of the genre without being like totally different, right? It's definitely a JRPG. No one would mistake it for anything else. But I do think it does a few things better. One of the things is the world building, I think, is very, very well done. And this starts, from what I understand, with Trails in the Sky, right? I mean, that's the first time that mythos and world is introduced. Is that correct?
Yeah, yep, it is.
Because you have other, because we were talking in kind of our pre-show chat, and there's apparently a lot of Legend of Heroes games that Falcom have done. In fact, I'm looking at this, and it's going all the way back to like 1992 or 1989 or something like that. But those didn't necessarily have, like, some of those storylines were connected, but not all of them were, and they weren't the Trails of Cold Steel
Right.
world.
Yep. That world started in Legend of Heroes 6. So, yeah, officially none of the follow-up games are Legend of Heroes 7, but they're all called Legend of Heroes. So,
Right.
Then yeah, so probably when we see Legend of Heroes 7, that's when we'll know that we're starting a new continuity. So
But yeah, going back to the verisimilitude of the world, you have this sort of region, Erebonia, right, that's talked about, and you have these various factions and a kind of fragile peace. In fact, it's a little, I have to say, like, it's a little disconcerting because it kind of reminds me of perhaps even our own situation, right, right now in the good old United States, where I don't think anyone would deny that, despite the 2020 thing and COVID and all the stuff that we're in sort of a golden age, right? Like in a lot of ways, like in terms of prosperity and all the things here, and that's kind of the case in this Erebonia with the Empire and all the various factions. But just like, and this is where I say it's a little disconcerting, there's a lot of fractures in that society. It's about ready to pop, right? There's a lot of fissures starting to appear, and they do a really good job of building that up throughout the game. Where you have the noble faction, which you immediately want to hate, but the game does a great job of making you not hate them, right? After a while, after you kind of learn, well, okay,
right.
they have a valid point of view as well. You sort of have the what they call the reformist faction, which would be almost like it's fun. It's funny to try to figure out what the reformist faction really is. They're not really Thomas Jefferson-esque sort of agrarian sort of reformers that want freedom. It's not really that because the chancellor. They call him
Mhm.
the blood and iron chancellor,
Right.
for heaven's
Yeah.
sake. This does not evoke Thomas Jefferson,
Right.
in any sense. But it's a reformist faction that they're trying to like undo the feudal system that they have with the nobles and a class system, I guess would be a better way to put it, right? And then you have people that are against the chancellor, which would be this sort of terrorist group that pops up. And they even ally with aspects of the noble faction, but not the entire noble faction. So there's a lot of things at play, right? And you even
Yep.
see that in the militaries. There's not just one army. There's the Imperial Army, which is and there is an emperor. Although it does, Patrick, seem a little bit to be like the emperor seems almost like the Japanese emperor or the British monarch, where it's the political power isn't really there. Did you get that
Right.
impression as well?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. And the interesting thing with all of these different factions and political groups and everything like this, the thing that I really like about this game, which also sort of makes the whole game feel like a prologue, but I really like this, is that you're not thrown into the middle of any of this. You're essentially a student enrolling in an academy, which is for the entire country. So you have people with all these different ideologies that are all going essentially to a university.
Right.
And so it's a very familiar experience where you go to a university and there's all kinds of people from different backgrounds, and you're in class with these people. You go on. I'm going to call them field trips, but they're more like long-term assignments in different regions of the country. So you're going to different regions of the country. So it feels like you're going through school and through classes, but you're learning all of these different political factions along the way, so that when you get towards the later portions of the game where the politics matter, it all makes sense.
Yes, and I think you pointed out something really cool. This is a pretty complex storyline, pretty complex set of actors on this stage, but yet they do such a good job of making it understandable to where you can actually keep track of it, because this is a weakness in the Yakuza games, which I dearly love, and I know you love them as well. Those games, it can be really, really hard to keep up with all the factions, right? I mean, you meet someone, you hear the little Yakuza ding when it's a new character introduced, and it's like, this person, the second lieutenant, chairperson, vice undersecretary of the Tojo clan family, Matsuyama.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? And it's like you just cannot
Yeah.
keep up with
But,
all these factions,
right.
right? And it
Yeah.
gets awfully confusing. Here they, especially since you mentioned the field trips, the field studies, that they make you do. Each one of them is kind of introducing you to a faction and their point of view as well, right? Which is, I think, really cool. And so I would say what you talked about also leads to one of my favorite aspects of this from a certain kind of game design perspective, which is the really tight hour to hour loop. And I had the same feeling about the last Falcom game that I played, which would have been Tokyo Xanadu, which they do a really good job setting up this predictable, I call it hour to hour loop, because games are all about loops, right? Like you have the moment to moment loop of, in this game it would be, at least in the dungeons and in the outside areas, walk around, explore, find enemies, touch them, go into combat. That's the loop, right? That's kind of the moment to moment loop. But then you have the hour to hour loop of this game, and that's really where this and Tokyo Xanadu, I think, do a great job, where it's like, okay, you have class, right? Because like you said, your character is a college, I want to say college student. They're probably like 17. It's sort of like a prep school. And you have to remember, this might have a little bit of a Japanese cultural influence. Like high schools in Japan are hard, and colleges are not like as hard, which is like the opposite as here. But whatever, it's a school that you go to, right? And you go to school, and so you have kind of one part of the loop is going to school, and then you get a free day. And the free day is when you can choose, the conversation points or whatever they call them, to which characters are you going to hang out with and all that. And that kind of makes you closer to them and whatever. And then you have the practical exam, which is a single combat trying to teach you something, which I think is very clever. Here's where, much like Fire Emblem Three Houses, I think they do a really clever job of like, we have this theme that we can bake into the game, right? Like you are a student, and so we can actually give you tutorials that are part of the story because you're a student, right? And the practical exams are basically like that. They teach you about the combat links and the various things. Although I will say, certain aspects, Patrick, I don't know if you remember this, I would text you at like 1 or 2 in the morning because certain things of the game were a little opaque.
Some of the game mechanics, like the whole concept of unbalancing, which what's very interesting about that is unbalancing. Not going to go into the details, but just it's a game mechanic that's actually pretty important. But if there was a tutorial about it, I missed it in Trails of Cold Steel 1. In the sequel, like within the first hour, they make a very big deal of giving you a tutorial about unbalancing. So I almost wonder if in Japan, if Falcom received some feedback about that and made sure to clarify how it works and how you do it and all of that in the sequel.
Yeah, I bet they did, because I don't recall being taught about unbalancing, and that can get frustrating. But to finish my thought about the hour-to-hour loop, you have the practical exam, and then you have the field study that we've referenced several times, and that's kind of where a lot of the story-driven stuff happens for the most part. You do have the old schoolhouse adventures, which is basically, that's your like Persona 3 Tartarus. You're sort of, hey, this is the dungeon you're going to revisit to sort of grind and level up and everything. That's the old schoolhouse, and there's a cool kind of storyline thing that goes on there. And that's part of the free day. After you're done hanging out with your friends or whatever, you go and bash monsters in the old schoolhouse. So you're never going too long in between the bashing monsters over the head with your sword aspects of the game. And then you start it over again. So again, it's like school, free day, with the schoolhouse bashing of the monsters, practical exam, field study, huge story event will happen as part of the practical or the field study, and then you're back. And it's such a predictable, in a very good way, predictable hour-to-hour loop. You just kind of know, this is what I'm going to do, then I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do that. I also think it tremendously helps the development of these games, that they have such a well-defined structure. I have to think it makes it easier to develop this in a disciplined way, where things, costs don't get overrun and they get things done on time. Patrick, weren't you telling me that Falcom has like never canceled a game?
That was my understanding. I don't know if that's true as of the current year, but at least a couple years ago that was true.
Yeah, so they seem like very, I want to say thrifty, but they had about 30 developers on this according to the credits, and I think that's, I don't think that's a huge team, but I don't think it's like incredibly small either when you consider, the sort of production values and scope of this. That seems, pretty reasonable. I mean, obviously compared to sort of AAA development that might happen in like Square Enix or like at a BioWare, that's small, but that's, again, when I think about the games I've been involved in my career, a lot of it were 20 or 30 people teams, and yeah, I think this game can totally get made with that sort of amount of staff or whatever. But yeah, talking about the combat a little bit, now that we've talked about the hour-to-hour loop, the sort of moment-to-moment loop, or the combat aspects of the game. So it is, again, like, it is recognizable as a JRPG, but it does some interesting things. It's turn-based, which obviously many other Falcom games are not. They're action ARPGs. This one is turn-based, but you can move your characters around the field. And that I found, Patrick, as I played the game, and the game got harder and harder as it got towards the end, positioning got much more important. Was that true for you as well?
Yeah, it was. And yeah, just to throw out a couple comparisons in case anyone listening has played these games, uh, I would say that the 2D version of this combat would be something like the old Lunar games, which were different from other 2D combat systems. In terms of more modern games, um, the Compile Heart games, like the Neptunia remakes and Fairy Fencer F, also use this style of combat. I would say it's closer to Fairy Fencer F, where positioning really does matter, and um, the arc and range of attacks, especially the magical attacks, matters. So, if anyone has played a bunch of JRPGs, I'd say that Fairy Fencer F is the closest comparison, but I think Trails of Cold Steel does it better.
Yeah, it's a good, satisfying combat system. It can frustrate you, as my text messages to you at weird times indicate, but it is one of those things, and this is kind of how I like to judge whether or not these things are well done, right? Like, okay, if you die a lot, okay, fine, but can you get better and figure it out? Because there's a puzzle there to figure out, right? And now, I think it's okay if sometimes the answer is to gain a few more levels. But if that's always the answer, I don't think that's a good game. If it's always the answer, you just have to grind in the dungeon for a few more hours and just simply make your stats better. Sure, that's going to happen sometimes. There was one section of the game, actually, where I just played really stupidly, and it bit me in the rear. That's when you go into the kind of, I like to call it the Ocarina of Time Hyrule Field part of the game, because you're on a horse, right? And you're sort of in this these mountainous plains where you're riding a horse around, that field study. Because you're on the horse, it's easy to avoid the combats, because it's one of those, it's not random combat. It's like touch the enemy in the world, then you go into the combat with them, right? So I just avoided all the combats until I got to the big story event and had a boss, and I wasn't leveled up enough. Obviously, that's what happens when you avoid the combats, right? So that's fine. Like, having to go back and level up a bunch when that happens is okay. But if you've been playing the game normally, and the answer to every boss fight is, well, I just have to gain a few more levels, I don't think that's good. And that's not the case here. Like, sometimes I would be totally struggling until I realized, wait a minute, if I change the composition of my party, it matters, right? Like, how many, because there's, you have characters that are close range, sword and board type fighters. You have magic users that are basically using staffs, what they call orbital staffs in this game's mythology. The orbital technology thing is basically their version of electricity and circuits and everything. So, if you, okay, I'm going to change my party composition, then I'm going to position them differently, because like you said, range matters. You can sort of get, sometimes there'll be a pair of bosses, it'll be two characters, and you need to have some of your party stand in one part of the field to draw their fire, and then you can have a melee fighter wailing away on them from behind. So there's all these wonderful options, tools that you're given to solve these combats, and eventually you can find the solution, but you will get a little frustrated. I think the game can be a little opaque, but once you discover those things, then it's a lot of fun.
Yep, I agree.
So moving on to I said it so well, folks. That's what happens. I just nail it with utter sort
Yeah.
of ludology perfection, right? That Patrick is stunned.
Yeah, the ludology perfection. Yeah, the moment I remember, which really exemplifies what you were talking about, is uh, there's a scene in some catacombs basically, and a couple biomechanical dogs attack you, and that
Oh, that's the worst.
yeah, I would expect that anyone who's played the game that they know that now it's probably clicked. Oh yes, exactly. That is exactly what we're talking about. If you've seen that moment where you really have to suddenly realize that there's a game mechanic that you've missed, and once you discover it, then it's like, okay, I can do this.
And so now I think we should talk a little bit about the sort of characterizations and all of that in the game. So you're a student and you have all these classmates, and they kind of do this Falcom thing. I'm discovering it's a Falcom thing, at least in the games I've played, where you kind of get to pursue what I like to call wholesome romance. Right? This is not Persona 5, where you can do stuff like date your teacher, weird stuff like that. I mean, I will say, Instructor Sarah definitely will flirt with you for sure, right, with your player character. But like, I don't think that's actually a romanceable option, or am I wrong about that?
Well, I mean, in as far as Trails of Cold Steel takes romances, yes, she is an option, but I mean, you don't end up. Well, I shouldn't spoil anything, but let's just say that the game recognizes the impropriety of a teacher-student relationship and never lets you forget that.
Right, right. And I guess to be fair to Persona 5, it also doesn't let you forget that either, but there's more. I don't know what I played, because it's funny. I played Tokyo Xanadu, then Persona 5, and then this game, right? So just there is this wholesomeness, I think, to the way Falcom does this aspect of JRPGs, where it's like much more innocent, I suppose.
Yeah, that's a good word for it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's quite right, and that's not even saying, because Persona 5 isn't like Mass Effect, where there's that kind of stuff that those games had or anything, but there is a sharper edge to all of the character interactions, I guess, and whereas the Falcom thing, it's much more much more wholesome, just in general, and there's such a wonderful cast of characters. I think they're all pretty unique. They're all fairly enjoyable to have to spend hours in the schoolhouse fighting monsters with or whatever. But let's talk about a couple of characters that did annoy me at first, and then they won me over, and that would be Machias and Eustace. So Machias is a son of a reformist faction, sort of governor, okay? And so he's nobility sucks, nobility's terrible, common people, yay, right?
Yeah.
Eustace is the son of one of the main noble houses, and at first appears super arrogant and aloof, and you want they do a clever thing here, I think. You want to hate, at least me, you want to like Machias, but you want to hate Eustace until you realize Eustace is really cool and Machias is a big dork, at least at first, right? And then you're frustrated.
Yep. Yeah, and the thing that's really interesting about that is, I mean, they're playing different angles with the whole nobility concept, because as you mentioned, Machias is not nobility. Yeah, he's considered a common person, a commoner. Eustace is nobility, but the thing is, Machias comes from a filthy rich family. So So there are even other characters in your class who he can't really relate to them either because he's completely rich, even though he's a commoner. And so like you said, he's kind of a dork, and he has a silver spoon in his mouth of his own. So
Yeah, they do a really good job. And by the way, if you're confused right now, I say Machias and whatever it is Patrick said, it's because I listened to the dub and Patrick listened to the Japanese, and so he's pronouncing the names in that manner. Just so you're aware of this. So anyway, like yeah, I think they do a good job with sort of playing around, having fun with your typical expectations and kind of typical stereotypes that you might have, and they do a good job of that throughout. I think, and the Machias Usus thing becomes this fun kind of erstwhile frenemy kind of thing. They never become, at least in this game, like super good buddies, but they do come to respect each other. And some of the characters even say, "Yeah, you're actually really good friends and don't realize it." Is sort of what your other classmates come to realize. And this is played out in, lest you think this is all just dialogue boxes and verbal voice acting audio and everything. This plays out very well in the field studies, right? Because you go
yep.
to basically Usus Town, which is just that it's not called that, but it's the town that he's in, and you kind of learn about the nobles. You learn about his brother, and actually how they both think their dad sucks. Basically, is what you learn there. And then you go to Machias Town, which is actually the capital of the empire, and you learn about that, and so you kind of get enriched with these character stories, but they're baked so well into the gameplay. So it's not this artificial story edifice. It's always always part of the game. Although I will say, Patrick, they try to do this a whole bunch with various different characters, and they base the field studies on resolving their differences. The Laura and Fee thing, I didn't feel that one nearly as much. What did you think of that one?
I thought that was fantastic. Those were two of my favorite characters. So focusing on the two of them, I thought that was great, and especially the part where like a big chunk of their rivalry was because they swam against each other, and Laura was mad that Fee didn't try hard enough when swimming. I thought that was very compelling.
See, here's the thing with that. Like, what bugs me about that storyline, all right, is this. Like, the whole, I mean, they have a duel, for heaven's sake. Right? Now, I'm not going to spoil any, like, massive things, but, but I will be a little spoilery on some of these character things, okay? Just, I know it's too late if you've listened to this and you're probably already mad and, sorry. Maybe I'll put something in the show notes that are mildly spoilery, but not all the way. So anyway, you have a duel, for heaven's sake. These two characters, they fight, okay? And the reason why, like, because I thought, okay, again, they're trying to do the same thing where they're setting up a situation and it appears like it's going one way, and then no, it's not, right? That's a little trickaroo. In this case, it's Fee belonged to a mercenary group, the Jaeger Corps, they call them. All right, and Laura is a noble. And so obviously what you think is they hate each other because, Fee's Jaeger Corps probably like killed a friend or murdered someone she knew, or because these are soldiers of fortune, basically, right? You think it's some deep thing like that, and instead it turns out to be, I just respect you so much, or whatever it was, something like that. I just think you're so cool that I don't know why I'm mad at you. Let's fight. I don't know.
I think there's that angle that I know you're way better than you're letting on. I respect your abilities. Why aren't you respecting us enough to actually try?
Right. I guess, see, you're smarter than me, and your superior IQ has enabled you to figure out what they were going for there. I just missed that. I'm just going to be honest. I didn't catch that aspect of what they were trying to do.
Right. Well, I was kidding when I said that it was when it was compelling, because regardless of how you talk it up, it's in the context of the game, comparing it to other rivalries, it's a pretty weak one. But there is one thing I want to make sure to mention here, because you talked about how they duel, and it's a duel that you watch what's really interesting is the techniques they use in that duel are actual abilities that the characters have.
That is true. Yes.
And yep. And they were abilities that I had not used up to that point because I tend to only start using something when I have to. And it turned out that those were some actually incredibly useful techniques. So it wasn't that they were just using random techniques in the duel. These were actually some of the best abilities. Like, for example, one of them that Fee used in the duel can do that whole unbalancing thing. And I was like, well, I'll try this out. And then it's like, oh, wow, that's actually a great ability. I should start using that now.
I'm trying to think of what some of the other. Not all of the field studies are character rivalries, right? Like when you go
Right.
to Ocarina of Time Horseland,
Yeah.
that's really just like, oh, my family is really cool in my area because it's an exotic area. No,
Mhm.
the other party members, the other classmates aren't familiar with it, so that's really just sort of isn't my home area cool, right? So there's not like a big character conflict you're trying to resolve there. I'm trying to think if there's any other sort of rivalries. There are some that aren't. They don't play out the same way, right? You have the character named after you, Patrick. Patrick, I think Hymus or something like that.
Yep.
Uh, uh,
Best character in the game. Yep.
and he's a noble that it's kind of funny. Like they love to do this. Now he's more of an obvious obnoxious noble. Like he's really jerky to Rean Schwarzer. Rean Schwarzer, by the way, is the main character, which we'll definitely talk about in a little bit here. But like he's sort of mean to you, but isn't all bad, right? He kind of is supposed to represent the sort of negative aspect of nobles because Eustace, even though he's the son of one of the main nobles, he was actually the illegitimate child of that noble and actually identifies a lot more of commoners, and that's where your mind gets blown. Right? And you realize his aloofness is just because he's like
Spoiler
Captain
alert.
Cool, right? Like he's,
Yeah.
not because he's like an aloof noble. He doesn't actually care about that stuff all that much. Although he will defend nobility, interestingly enough. Like he'll defend their interests. So it's not like he's a total, rebel in that way. But then you have Elliot the musician. Again, he likes everyone. There's no character like rivalries there. And then you have a couple of interesting characters that join you in midstream. You have the 12-year-old girl with the crazy robot, who's sort of comic relief, but basically made me want to stab myself with an ice pick. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. She was the Yuffie of the game.
yes, I think so. And then you have Crow, who's the brah dude. Whoa, like like the Keanu Reeves stand-in
Yeah.
character
Yeah.
of the
I'm
game.
yeah. I'm surprised he didn't go around wearing a visor the whole time.
That's right. Yes. And then, of course, we've mentioned her before. Your teacher, instructor Sarah, which is actually I found. Now I know you didn't listen to the dub, when you played, but I thought that was very well acted by the English voice actress. It's kind of an interesting. Now, only in a JRPG is someone that's 25 years old like portrayed as like over the hill, like she is a little bit from time to time, which I thought was amusing, right? Like, oh, how old are you? 25. Oh, you're so old. Oh, right. Like that's just kind of a JRPG thing. But she's your super old wise teacher, but she actually is a heavy drinker. And look, I mean, I recognize this is not entirely the idea of the swashbuckling, heavy drinking, fighting gal is probably not completely out of bounds in terms of manga and anime. Am I making that up, or is that like something you might see in other media, Patrick?
Yeah. Yeah. It's around. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's a cool characterization. It's a fun character. She kind of gives you a comeuppance. Actually, she gives Eustace and Machias a comeuppance earlier. Where she kind of kicks their asses. I'll just say, and it's a fun character. But we need to talk about Rean Schwarzer, the main character. And here's the thing. I'm not going to use that really loaded term people use for this because I don't want to get people mad at us. But there is a certain thing where if you write a character that has no weaknesses, that are just like moral paragons, and Rean is in danger of being this, and I won't spoil the plot, but until the end, and I think they do a nice thing that might get you mad, but it does a good job of making sure that you don't think this character is someone that's too strong and has no weaknesses. But at first, it is kind of ludicrous, isn't it?
Yeah, I think we can say what his character weakness is, don't you? I
Yes,
mean, yeah,
yes,
I think we can
absolutely.
say that. Yeah. I mean, his character weakness is that he cares about other people so much.
That's right. Yes. Yes. And it's from literally the first moment of the game, basically, you learn this, right? And that's even his master, like he's so basically to set up the main character a little bit so people understand. So he's a noble, but like a minor, super minor noble, like one of the lowest ranked nobles out there. But despite that, like, you know, his father seems to be like a man of the people, although you never really meet his father in the game. He talks about him, but you never really meet him. And he's not the the biological child of his father. They find him or adopt him from somewhere or whatever. And so he then, you know, he attends sort of this. I guess attends is not the right word. He's the sensei of a great master where he learns this school of sword fighting called the School of Eight Leaves, or the Form of Eight Leaves, or something Eight Leaves, right?
Yep.
And so he's and that's like a it's portrayed in the game as very special, like, oh, you're a student of the Eight Leaves, whoa, that's elite, you know. But even his sensei said this to him: you care about others so much that you won't save yourself, right? That's the great weakness of Rean Schwarzer. And at least in the first like half to 2/3 of the game, it does play out in a way where you kind of almost roll your eyes at it a little bit, right?
Yep. But then, yeah, the ending, as you said, frustrating in a sense. But when you remember Rian's character and his quote unquote weakness, you're kind of like, oh, I see what they're doing there.
And you know, I will say then to kind of transition to this aspect of the game. So, like Tokyo Xanadu and like Persona 5, like a lot of JRPGs, you know, you have, you know, this ability to socialize with characters and even very kind of I would say gentle romance. Again, it's not like Mass Effect or whatever. But you do get that option to sort of, you know, get to know, or even like Fire Emblem has become more and more Mass Effect-esque over time, right, with how they've implemented that. Here it's, you know, very innocent, you know, but it's definitely there. It's definitely there to motivate you. You get a certain amount of social points to spend or whatever, and you pick which characters you want to, you know, spend extra time with or whatever, and all of that. So I will say that my favorite character would be, I'm gonna say Elisa. I know that's not how you pronounce her, but like as far as when I got the option, and I'll tell you why, because we haven't talked about her yet. Her storyline is kind of interesting. Her mother is like basically the CEO of like the biggest corporation in the empire, right? And it's one of those things where she has this sort of interesting cross purposes, where on the one hand she actually expresses an ambition to run the company, but she also, you know, has really a lot of second thoughts about that. Doesn't necessarily think that everything the Rhineford Corporation does is moral or ethical, and maybe doesn't want to run the company. And so she sort of vacillates between thinking she can do a better job than her mother does, but doesn't want to do it because, you know, they make, you know, horrible weapons of war, and there's these special weapons they made that are like horrible weapons of basically mass destruction they talk about. But her, and this is where I think the game is interesting, Patrick. So often you think that's going to be the villain, and let's divulge a little bit into this. We'll depart from the sort of getting to know the characters and all that to this, because I think this is interesting. There's so many characters you think are going to be villains, but they're not the villains, right? Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, because I mean, even just visually, you look at these people and it's like, okay, that's going to be the villain.
Like the Chancellor, for
Right.
instance.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you just have to see a picture of him, and you would say, well, that's the villain. But yeah, I think that Alice's mother is another good example where you're just kind of like, well, she could be a villain. You're not sure, but maybe she could be.
Right, and they do that a lot. And each one of these characters, they end up being board members of your school, right? And they all, what's kind of fascinating is they all have opposing agendas, right? You have Elisa, and of course Patrick's pronouncing it in the Japanese fashion, but that's what he meant earlier. So you have Elisa Reinford and her mother, Irina Reinford. She's on the board. Eustace's older brother Rufus is on the board of the school that you're attending, right? The Machias' father, Governor Regnitz, is on the board, and so you have all these different and they're all kind of representing the various factions in the Empire at the school, and they have some cool scenes where they're actually arguing about how to handle certain things or whatever, because they each have their own little agendas here, and so you're constantly guessing who's the villain, and then of course you have Chancellor Osborne, who absolutely looks like he's gonna try to go completely rogue and nuke half the population. I mean, he just looks so freaking evil, right? And I'll leave it up to the player to figure out who the villain really is, but they surprise you. I'll just put it that way, right? And it's not like with a lot of these people, like when you think of Elisa Reinford, yes, she does endorse developing some terrible weapons at her company. When you look at Chancellor Osborne, he does annex sort of countries sort of forcibly, right? When you look at Governor Regnitz and the reformist faction in general, yes, what they're doing, I suppose, is good for the common people, but they're breaking a lot of eggs on the way. And of course, the nobility, they also stomp on people. So it's these factions, they're so realistically portrayed. There's no moral black and white with these factions, all shades of gray. Although I should ask, Patrick, who is your favorite faction?
I don't know. I don't have a favorite faction. Maybe further in the series I'll figure that out. But yeah, I don't have a favorite faction per se. One thing I did want to mention, though, off of what you were saying about how there all these characters and you're thinking they may be the villain, but then you will be surprised, that I want to mention is while playing the game, you kind of have the sense that the game's going to try to throw you for a loop. So even going in, knowing that you're going to be surprised by who the villains are, with the way they handle things and particular events that we won't talk about, I think that people would still be surprised even when they're expecting to be surprised.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I 100% agree. So nothing in this podcast is going to, I think, eliminate that surprise for you. So that's really good. It's clever storytelling. So well done, Falcom on that front. So going back though, because we are at 52 minutes now, so I'm going to go back to Elisa Reinford a little bit, who's the character I picked all my social points on. When they're not always available, right? Sometimes they're not like an option or whatever. And the reasons I found that interplay between her being the daughter of a huge, sort of a woman who runs a massive corporation, and she tries to play it down, like her kind of, the way Eustace handles that, like, hey, I'm from nobility, is he just owns it, right? Eustace just owns it. That's kind of how he handles it. And that's why he comes off so cool and assured and everything. Elisa does not try to just own it, right? She tries to hide it. But yet I find what's interesting is it comes out in ways that she can't help, right? Like she has a servant that they send even to help you, to help the students or whatever. And there's this great moment in the game where you're at her mansion, which is basically a high-rise building in the city that she lives in. And you have all this luggage, and she just says, leave the luggage here. The servants will pick it up. Or actually her main servant, Sharon, who is Sharon, by the way, is like, if you want to talk about like stereotypical JRPG maid character, like, that's one of them. Like that's but at any rate, yeah, I mean, she just leaves her luggage there for Sharon to clean up. And actually the other party members, the other, your classmates, they comment on this. They're like, that was sort of rude, like, so I thought that was cool. Like she's trying hard, but like still, your background is your background, and it's like you're a fish in water. There's going to be things that you do that you don't even realize you're doing. It's like I'll say as a personal anecdote, My parents never listen to this podcast, so it's safe for me to bring them up. They'll probably listen to this one and hear this, and I'll hear about it from them. But like, I always find that like there are certain things in my life where I'm just used to, like, they are used to, they haven't moved a lot obviously, but they've moved a few times, and every time they've moved to and from a house or something, they just pay all the monies to have like movers do everything, and I'm super mega cheap, right? And so I do all that crap myself, and that's an area where my parents' attitude would be like, why in the world did you do all that yourself? And I'm like, you're more advanced in life than me. It's easier for you to afford to spend all that. I can't, so I'm gonna lift heavy things for hours, right? It's that kind of thing where it's like the attitude of, why wouldn't you just do this thing that's actually not maybe practical for you to do, that sort of thing.
Yep.
So Patrick,
I think that's again, that's just another sign of good writing where
yes,
they really were living inside each character's head when they wrote those moments.
Yeah, absolutely. And wonderful job, wonderful storyline, great world building. And when it's matched to a deep, sort of very systems heavy RPG that you can really sink your teeth into, then it's like Nirvana, right? And that's why, I can put 90 hours in this game, because I have to have both. Like, there are some people that can't have the interesting narrative, and they can just, they want the good systems, and if the good systems are there, the narrative almost doesn't matter. I have to have both. If it's a game devoid of interesting narrative stuff, then I just can't hang with it. If it's a game that has narrative stuff but very, very light gameplay, especially if it's purporting to be a JRPG, right? Like, I can totally get down with Phoenix Wright and games that are more narrative heavy, but if it's purporting to be a JRPG, you need to give me the goods, right? With well-designed combat and exploration. So, your favorite character, Pat? If mine was Elisa, who is your favorite character?
Yep. So to give a little bit of setup, there's a point in the game where you, as Rean Schwarzer, can select who you're going to go dance with. All right, and your little sister asks you who you're going to go dance with, and based on the social events that I had done and everything, and also just for the LOL. I picked the over the hill 25-year-old instructor Sarah, and the little sister's reaction to that made it all worthwhile. Yeah, but then I played through the game a second time, and this time I picked the student council president, Toa, because there's a scene where she talks about where she once did a kind of pop concert, and I liked her outfit when she did that concert.
Oh dear.
But but no, the real choice, because I actually picked every single person.
You wanted to see how it would all play out, yeah.
I was just throwing that out there for laughs, because that was actually a funny moment in the game. But the real one who I picked in the end, because this does carry over into later scenes, I ended up picking Fee, the Jaeger Corps girl.
Well, she's a cool character. That probably would have been my second choice, I guess. And by the way, she's voiced in the English dub by the same actress that does the cat in Persona 5, just as a random bit of trivia. But yeah, she's an interesting character because she's aloof. She falls asleep all the time, doesn't seem to care, but yet somehow is this highly trained warrior extraordinaire, right? Like,
yeah. The game basically sets her up as being just on a completely different talent level from everyone else.
Right. All right, well, I think we have gone a good bit here on this. I'll just say, is sort of one of my closing statements here is this. Okay, so again, I've mentioned this a few times. This to me, when because again, I have to like assume that if you're listening to this and you play, like newer PS4, even now PS5 games, like why in the world should you play something that was a PS3 game? Well, I'll tell you why. Because I will say that these types of games that are single player, that are not monetized, other than, paying for the game initially, right? where the systems are deep and the storyline is good and well done. These are not being made all the time anymore in the environment that we're in now. And so every single example of a game like this that's well made, great story, great gameplay, the visuals are, it's, I just got done with my classes at Purdue talking about game design fundamentals, and one of the things that Chris Crawford says in The Art of Computer Game Design is that the graphics should support the fantasy, right? That's a core thing he talks about. You're selling a fantasy to the player, and do the graphics do the job of that? And yes, like even now, with a lot of distance between its original release and now, the graphics do the job exactly, right? Do you agree with that, Patrick?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and like you were talking before, they're vibrant and uh, good artistry. I mean, good artistry goes a long way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's good art direction. I love all the uniforms and the various different towns you go in are all sort of constructed in a way that's architecturally interesting and distinct from one another. It's a game you can definitely, because here's the thing, when I play a game now, it's like it's going to be an hour or two every day, and when it's a JRPG, that means it's going to be months, of an hour or two every day. And so, boy, that world better be bright and inviting. The characters better be mostly really enjoyable, and just like Tokyo Xanadu, this game absolutely delivers the goods. Now, I can't immediately go into Trails of Cold Steel 2. I own it as per your advice, but I need to take a break. So I'm playing Yakuza 7. Okay, so that's what I'm doing now, but I'm definitely going to check out Trails of Cold Steel 2. And Patrick, there's multiple other games after that, right?
Yep, there are.
Yeah, it just keeps going. There'll be Trails of Cold Steel 27 at some point,
Yep.
right? And Rean Schwarzer will be 82.
I mean, yeah, you could even go back and start playing the Trails of the Sky games, for example, if you haven't already. So, I mean, there's definitely other places to go from here.
Patrick, do you have any closing thoughts on Trails of Cold Steel?
Yeah, I guess what I would say is when I think of the greatest RPGs ever made, I think of games like Lunar, Emerald Dragon, the early Ys games, okay? Trails of Cold Steel is not that. It's not even close. I mean, it's the first in a four-part series, and even after 80 hours, it feels like the first chapter because it kind of ends just when you really start to see where it's going.
That's
But the
right,
thing
yeah.
is, like what you were saying, the game is really fun to play. I like the characters, I like their banter, the combat is engaging, but it's swift. I mean, you're not going to be spending a lot of time in battles, but they're going to be fun. And I would definitely play more of that. And since the plot does open up at the end and you see where it's going, I mean, that means the sequel can only be better. So I'm definitely eager to play through Trails of Cold Steel 2.
Yeah, ditto, especially because, and I suppose I'll limit myself to what I'll say here. There's kind of a shift in the technology in the game that's really fascinating that is going to affect the next one and does open things up and opens kind of a whole new world, basically. So yeah, can't wait to do that. Once I get through Yakuza 7 and then maybe some other games in my backlog, I'll get to Trails of Cold Steel, but I definitely will, though. All right, everyone, thanks for listening. As always, please rate us, especially because we took such a long hiatus before you heard this. It'd really be helpful if you gave us a positive review, iTunes, wherever you listen to podcasts. Please do that. It would help us tremendously. Again, I'm Rojo Games on Twitter, Rojo Games 80 on Instagram, so I'm very easy to find. If you want to send a carrier pigeon to contact Patrick, I suppose you can do that. Otherwise, you could send a message through me, I guess, if you have a question for Patrick. So until next time, we'll see you all later.